Bene, arriviamo allora all'ultima presentazione della giornata, sarà da parte di EFSI, quindi un organismo internazionale che conosciamo bene, sarà in inglese e sarà tenuto dalla signora Claire Liptrot che lavora per Croda, quindi viene a trovarci viene direttamente. Claire, are you coming from UK or from? No, from Spain now.
I'm from the UK.
UK, but not traveling.
Oh no, I came from Spain.
Directly from UK, ok. Va bene, allora ci parlerà, come vedete, Polymers and microplastics in Europe.
Oh, the arrows. Thank you.
Claire, to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Oh no, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So, my name's Claire Liptrot. I'm sorry, I don't speak Italian, so you'll have to do with my English. So I'm currently the chair of the FC Regulatory and Product Safety Group and the chair of the Polymer Working Group. And so what I'm going to talk about today is about the polymer landscape from a regulatory perspective. So what's changing, what's coming, what's new. I think we all know that the regulatory landscape for polymers is changing. It's been changing for a number of years now. We've been talking about different legislation, especially in relation to microplastics. But unlike other legislation, it's kind of been a lot slower paced. So if we're comparing to cars, it's more a Fiat 500 than a Ferrari. You know, we go to Polymer Reach and it's even slower. But we are starting to see some movement now, and we are starting to see some changes coming through. So in the next 25 minutes, hopefully, I'll be able to give you a little bit of an insight as to what's happening and what's coming and where we are. So in 2020, we'll start with Polymer Reach. First off, or polymers requiring registration as it's more commonly known. And in 2020, we started off with a report from Wood Peter Fisk Associates that are consultants to the European Commission. And it gave us a first glimpse as to what Polymer Reach could have in store for us. And since then, industry has been working, and what was identified in this report was that grouping of polymers chemically is absolutely key to good legislation. And in grouping polymers together will reduce the amount of animal testing required, and also will get legislation in place quicker and more efficiently. And so since then, industry has been collaborating with the European Commission in terms of how to group polymers together. We've had a lot of pilot projects, and initially the idea was they would be finished and done by mid-2021. We're still working on them today, and it's near the end of 2022. Initially, we thought there was going to be legislation by the end of 2022. We're not near that either. So I really like this depiction of grouping. So this is taken from the sealants industry. I think it's really clever because what it says is you might start with the same substances, so you might have the same bricks to begin with, but you can put them together in lots of different ways and come up with all different kinds of creations. And it doesn't mean that you can necessarily use read-across data for them or group them together for a chemical registration. So yeah, that's why it's proving a lot more difficult. And as industry, we anticipated this, and you know, we said these timelines are quite ambitious. Maybe we need to scale them back a bit, but actually, you know, on working with the European Commission and the difficulties they've seen with grouping, they actually agree. So this isn't my slide. This is one from the European Commission. You know, the universe of polymers, it's vast and complex, but likely there's some galaxies out there. I hope so. I really do hope so. And there are some galaxies out there. And it is, you know, it's talking about grouping. We will get there. We just need more time. And at the moment, this is what's delaying polymers requiring registration and Polymer Reach. And so there's two options on the table for us now. One is to go with like an iterative process, a bit more pragmatic, learning as we go, adding to the information and being a bit more investigative. Another option is to go with just do the best that we can with the information that we've got. And the second option is what's being favoured by the authorities. And the idea behind that is that they will gather some information during the notification process for Polymer Reach, and then that will help with notification. All depends on the information we gather. But just to put it into context of what this really means, when we talk about polymer registration and we talk about polymer registration under REACH, what do we actually mean and how do we go about it? Well, we start on step 1 with what they call the polymer requiring registration assessment. And what you get is you get a flow chart. Now, there's been various iterations of this flow chart, but the latest flow chart, you kind of work your way through and say, yes, 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 oh, I require registration. No, I'm out of scope. It's great, it's quite easy, it's really nice. But in the latest version, unless you are a polymer precursor, which means you're an intermediate that's used to make another polymer, and you're only used as an intermediate under REACH, and you're shipped under strictly controlled conditions, so no handling, no touching, then pretty much everything else is in scope at the minute. So there's no exemptions, polyesters are no longer exempted, there's no polymer of low concern criteria. So essentially, where we are at the minute is every polymer is going to need a registration. But even, I say all polymers need notification, there will be some that fall out of scope, but every single polymer will require then a notification, whether you need a registration or not. And what the notification aims to do is to help with this grouping process. So the idea is that by gathering certain data on all polymers, we can say, right, okay, you belong in this group, or you belong in that group. Or it also allows ECHA to say, well, how many polymers are we actually placing on the market in Europe? Are there how many, what are we talking? When we say there's lots of polymers, what do we mean? And it also allows us, as with other REACH, to know who else is placing products on the market, work together with them to have joint registrations under REACH. And then once we've notified all our polymers and ECHA have checked that we do meet the criteria either for falling out of scope of registration or for being in registration, we have to actually do a registration. So what's involved in a registration? In all honesty, we don't really know. I said there's data lacking. We don't know what's involved. You know, for REACH today, we know if you're in a certain tonnage band, you've got a certain data set, and that's what you do. We know that that will come for polymers, and we know that polymers will be grouped in by their molecular weight. So group 1, less than 1,000 Daltons, group 2, 1,000 to 10,000 Daltons, and group 3 will be over 10,000 Daltons. And what we do know is that the higher the molecular weight, the less information that will be required as part of your registration. But other than that, we don't really know what that information is. It's not clear and it's not available today. So in terms of where we're going next with Polymer Reach, seeing as we were expecting to be starting registrations in 2024, actually we're thinking that the finalisation of the commission proposal is likely to be Q1 2023, with entry into force probably about 2027, and notifications could take place in 2028 and registrations somewhere in the 2030s. There are a lot of question marks. That's because we're not sure how to get there in terms of the grouping and how we'll be able. The grouping is really going to be key to what these dates be. So moving away from Polymer Reach and onto something a little more imminent, microplastics. So we've been talking about this for years. I know FC have been giving presentations for years, Powell has been giving presentations for years on microplastics, what's happening, what's coming, and we finally have draft legislation. It was published in summer this year, and the European Commission met on the 23rd of September to discuss, discuss the draft legislation and how they're going to move it forward. Since then, we've had some meetings with the European Commission, and it's become clear that actually passing this draft legislation isn't necessarily as easy as maybe first thought and first anticipated. And they're saying they'll need at least another 3 or 4 meetings to discuss the draft legislation. And whilst not written down anywhere, or what was said is that, the text might change. So everything I'm about to tell you, I hope it's right. It is right as of the draft legislation, but it could change if the member states decide to do a little bit more and reword it. So, what was new in the draft legislation? In all honesty, not that much. It was very, very similar to the draft SEAC and RAC opinions. The definition remained pretty much the same. So a microplastic is still defined as a solid polymer that has dimensions of less than 5 millimeters, or if you're a fiber, a particle length of less than 50 millimeters, with a length to diameter ratio of greater than 3. And obviously this solid polymer has to be present at greater than 1% in your particle, as part of your particle or as a coating. The restriction level is still 0.01% in consumer products. That hasn't changed. And we still have some exclusions that we can use. So natural, non-chemically modified polymers are still exempt from the restriction. The definitions of natural and the definitions of chemically modified remain the same as that are in REACH today. Biodegradable polymers are also exempted from this restriction, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about biodegradability in a little while, because I know there's a lot of questions on how do we test, what tests do we use, what do we have to do, so I'll do that one in a little bit more detail. Polymers with solubility of greater than 2 grams per litre are also exempted from microplastics restriction, and what the draft legislation has done is provide us with some guidelines that we have to use. So it's got a bit more information. It states that we've got to test using OECD 105 or 120, and it does list specific parameters that we have to test against, so specific pHs, temperatures, etc. And we have a new exclusion, polymers without carbon atoms. So, and the reason for this is because basically persistence can't be proved or unproved because they don't contain any carbons, is essentially why. Other derogations that still are in place, so industrial sites are not restricted to 0.01%, obviously. Synthetic polymers that are contained, which means when they're used and disposed of, the polymer is not released into the environment. Polymers that are incorporated into a solid matrix and remain within that matrix during their intended use. And then synthetic polymers where, when they're formulated with or when they're used, they change their physical properties, so they no longer meet the definition of a microplastic, i.e. a solid polymer. Now, these materials are still considered as microplastics. They're just not restricted to 0.01%. So unlike the biodegradable polymers and the soluble polymers, these are considered microplastics. And why this is really important, we're happy that we've kept those derogations, but why this is really important is because those derogations link directly to labelling and instructions for use and disposal. And this is something as an industry we wanted more information on, in terms of what does that actually mean? Labelling for who? Is it labelling for ingredient suppliers? Is it labelling for end consumers? What does this actually mean? And we do have a little bit more information, not much, for polymers in the solid matrix or that change their physical properties. Those products will have to have instructions for use and disposal. Again, there's no more information than that, which makes it really difficult to work with. But what the Commission have been clear about is that they would like industry to work with e-labelling. The use of mobile phones now is so prolific that they would really like to see e-labelling as part of this initiative. For industrial sites, what we will have is instructions for use, and then this specific statement that says, this ingredient contains is a microplastic under EU REACH. That will be on the label somewhere, and we'll have to say what the concentration of the microplastic is, and then we'll have to provide information to downstream users in terms of how to handle that so that they remain compliant, and instructions for use and disposal have to be extremely clear. And in both these cases, we've got 24 months after entry into force of the legislation before we have to have this labelling on pack. A third and new category is makeup, lip and nail care products. And they're going to have a specific statement that says contains microplastics. And this will come into effect 8 years after entry into force of the legislation. So this is really new. And I'll explain a little bit more about this when we come to entry into force dates for the legislation. Now, linked with labelling and instructions for use is annual reporting. And this again was another concern of industry, because annual reporting involves you monitoring the volumes of microplastics that you use and report them to ECHA, and then this information will be made available on a website. And that was kind of the limit of the information we had. And it's like, well, hang on a minute, what does that actually mean? Whose website? What are people seeing? Because if you are using, for example, a solid polymer that transfers into, it changes its size and shape, it's no longer a microplastic, but according to labelling instructions, is still a microplastic and has to be labelled with instructions for use. Do we then have to report this to ECHA, and where's this made available? So we have a little bit more clarification in the draft legislation. We know that it's going to apply to pellets, flakes and powders. We know that it's going to apply to manufacturers and downstream users in terms of industrial downstream users. And we know that we're going to have to provide information such as the generic identity of the polymer, the description of the use, and then for each use that it has, the volume that's sold into that use, and estimated quantities of release into the environment. It still didn't necessarily, we were hoping for a little bit more because we're a bit worried about double counting. So if we have to count it as an ingredient like manufacturer, and as well as a formulator, if it transforms into a non-microplastic, how does this work? And there was a little bit more clarity in that it was like, well, it's the first actor in the supply chain, which fits with REACH as it is today, but then will require us to go down the same process of everybody has to declare their uses to the suppliers so that they can be reported. But again, for that example, maybe of microplastics that then change their physical properties, that could be formulation specific, maybe not necessarily an intention of the ingredient. You don't know, there's lots of different scenarios out there. So a little bit more information is required. Biodegradation. We said we'd talk a little bit more about biodegradation and testing. So where we were before the draft legislation was that if you have OECD screening tests and you pass those, happy days, carry on, you're no longer a microplastic and you can formulate without restriction. So that's great. If you do fail an OECD screening test of the 301s, 302s, it wasn't the end of the world, because you move on to these Group 4 and Group 5 tests, which are the ISO tests that you have to do in 3 different compartments. What we did get was a little bit more information within the draft legislation on the test methodologies that would be accepted as part and parcel of a biodegradation assessment. So in Group 1, you can use OECD 301 B, C, D, and F. And if you attain 60% biodegradation in 28 days, then you're not a microplastic. It's great. The 10-day window does not apply for polymers. In Group 2, we had the OECD 301s, but with the addition of the 310 and the 306. And you can achieve 60% in 60 days is a pass for these Group 2 projects. And again, 10-day window is not a requirement. Now, for me, the biggest change came in in Group 3, because with each publication of draft legislation, the amount of biodeg tests that we could use to prove that our polymer is not a microplastic has slowly been dwindling away. And in Group 3, there's only OECD 302C. But what again is interesting is that they state that pre-adapted inoculum is not permitted. However, a pass rate is considered as greater than 70% in 14 days as opposed to 28, which is quite a step change. So what that means is if you've got an OECD 302B test or a 301A or E test, it insinuates that those will not be allowed to prove in the biodegradation assessment, so that something more needs to be done. So that's definitely one to watch. And another question we had around biodegradability was, how do you actually test for biodegradability? If we're saying that a polymer present at 1.5% in your particle or as your coating needs to be tested for biodegradability, how do we do that? You know, there was an insinuation, do you test the coated particle? But then actually from a scientific point of view, that doesn't work, because you can only test homologous materials in an OECD test. You shouldn't really test mixtures for biodegradation. And what the Commission have said is actually the product, when it's tested, needs to be representative of the end product. So if you have a coating, what you can do is you can coat an inert bead, for example. As long as the coating that you do is the same thickness, same concentration, same chemistry, you can test a coated inert like glass bead. And you can use that as a way to test whether or not your product is biodegradable. As long as it is similar in concentration, size, and form, then that will be absolutely fine. So entry into force dates. So to be honest, again, there's not been too much change here. So microbeads are going to be banned. So the small plastic beads, I don't think they even exist in formulations anymore, but they will be banned immediately as soon as they come into effect. Encapsulated fragrances will be 6 years after entry into force of the legislation. Rinse-off cosmetic products stay at 4 years. I'm going to skip over to other leave-on cosmetics stay again at 6 years after entry into force. And then we have this new one, makeup, lip, and nail care products. They have a 12-year transition date for this legislation. But if you remember back to the labelling, after 8 years, you have to say contains microplastics. So if you haven't reformulated after 8 years, your bottle, your lipstick will have to say contains microplastics. So for me, essentially, I think 12 years could really be seen as 8. Maybe I'm being a bit cynical. But not everyone will want to put contains microplastics on the back of pack. So in summary, polymer reach is proving as difficult as we thought it was going to be. There's no doubt about that. It's moving at a slower pace than we thought it would. And that is all down to grouping. But it's important to get the grouping right so that we don't unnecessarily animal test. For microplastics, draft legislation is very similar to what we had before in the RAC and SEAC opinion. There is some further information that helps us a little bit more, but more guidance is needed, more clarifications are needed. There's not enough information for us to say, this is exactly what it means, and this is what we're going to have to go away and do as industry. Following the comments from the European Commission, will it stay that way? Who knows? We'll find out after Christmas. They're still stating that H1 2023 is when we can expect microplastic legislation. So we'll wait. We'll just keep watching. I think they're definitely topics to watch, to keep an eye on. There's a lot changing, there's a lot moving, and we can't give you definitive, this is exactly what it means yet. But hopefully it'll become clearer as time goes on. Thank you.